We're going to talk a little bit about disc flight, because now we have an idea why wind is doing what it does.
It's just at least being generated.
At least, yeah. And I think some of this will come with experience, too. Same experience of learning how to play the wind, where the more I start to visualize where the thermals are and watch my disc, I can determine if I was right or wrong, and that's the feedback I can learn from, right?
Correct.
Okay. What about the changes in winds early in the flight of a drive, when your disc is flying fast? I mean, it appears to not affect it as much at faster speeds. That's accurate?
Depends how clean your angles are. So I think, Scott, what we need to talk about now is disc flight relative to the airspeed. So one of the tools I've used for years, long before it's come into vogue, is I've used a radar gun and I've used a rangefinder. Let's talk about like the radar gun. So I know for myself that I throw, on average, 60 miles an hour. I'm plus or minus 2 or 3 miles an hour depending on the day and depending on my back. He said I'm a Masters player.
Right.
So I throw 60 miles per hour. But let's say that I'm throwing into a 10 mile an hour headwind. So we've got a 10 mile an hour headwind, okay? Now, if I'm going 60 miles an hour, headwind's going this way, I'm throwing this way. Now, do I need to add these two together or subtract them? Let's remember that the disc is flying through the air. 60 miles an hour is relative to my position. I am stationary, and the disc is leaving my hand traveling at a ground speed of 60 miles an hour. But the air is not stationary, the air is moving. And so once the disc gets into the air, it's going to be feeling different effects than I will be. So as the disc is flying, it's going into a 10 mile an hour headwind to me, and it's coming this direction. And so my disc is going to be feeling, how much, Scott?
70.
70, yeah, my disc is traveling 70 miles an hour. You know, that's Simon speed, that's, AB speed, that's all the top of the level guys, they're throwing this and above. My disc, I never throw it at 70 miles an hour. I don't know what it does at 70 miles an hour. What we know that will happen, because I've done this before, is when my disc gets into that air, it's going to flip over, it's going to do a lot of things, because Simon's never thrown my disc either.
So now also, you're throwing 60 miles an hour, but you also have the spin that you typically generate
Correct.
at 60 miles an hour, yet the disc is going 70. So it's not only going faster relative to the wind, it has less spin
Stability
relative to the speed.
Correct.
So that's why the disc becomes understable or turns over more.
Exactly.
Okay.
And so I'm generating enough spin to go 60 and stay at its relative stability. It's 60, but it's flying 70. So the disc that when you throw into a head, and the reason they get unpredictable is because you never throw that accelerated speed. And so now you've got to make changes to your own throw to do that. Let's do it opposite. So I throw 60 miles an hour, and I'm throwing this direction, right? And I've got a 10 mile an hour tailwind. Okay? So this right here we added. What do we do here? Am I going to add or subtract the air from my airspeed? Because the disc is going to be going at a ground speed of 60 miles an hour regardless. It's going to be traveling across the ground. But what it's going to feel, the apparent air it's going to be feeling over its flight plate, is going to be 60 minus 10. It's going to feel like it's flying 50. And so my disc is going to act far more overstable. It's going to act, and that's really because it's got a speed for this, but the nose is going to typically want to pop up on you and just run away.
Right, and this is actually why a lot of you, even if you have a decent sidearm, find it difficult to throw the sidearm into a headwind, because it's spin relative to speed. Backhands typically have more than enough spin. Mm-hmm. So that 40 mile an hour backhand throw that has enough speed for 50 miles an hour can be thrown into a 15 mile an hour headwind just fine. But if you have barely enough spin for your 40 mile an hour sidearm, and then you have the 10 mile an hour headwind, you don't have enough spin relative to the 50 mile an hour throw, the disc wobbles and turns over. At least that's why a lot of players, even with good sidearms, choose backhand anhysers in a headwind. Is
correct? I think that's correct.
So I explained that really poorly, and it's haunting me. What I mean is, most players typically have enough spin on their backhand throws. Spin's not an issue. For example, when you throw a 40-mile-an-hour backhand, you probably have enough spin for a 60-mile-an-hour throw to fly with stability. So if you're throwing 40 miles an hour into a 10-mile-an-hour headwind, meaning the relative speed of the disc is now 50 miles an hour, your 40-mile-an-hour throw has enough spin for 60 miles an hour, more than enough to handle the 50-mile-an-hour relative speed. With sidearm, generating spin is more of a challenge. So even a player with a decent sidearm who throws 40 miles an hour and generates enough spin for a 40-mile-an-hour throw to fly with stability, if they throw into a 10-mile-an-hour headwind, they're now throwing a disc with a relative speed of 50 miles an hour, but only enough spin for a 40-mile-an-hour throw, meaning the disc loses a lot of stability. That's why a lot of players with decent sidearms will still choose the backhand if the headwind is extreme enough.
Understanding that is super key. So let's go. I did a video. I did a random thing that I put up on Instagram at one point. I was just curious. I built a big grid on the ground, and then I threw my disc into it to see what my RPMs were, and then my RPMs versus my forehand, and it was significantly different. Forehand RPMs are a lot slower. So I've done that test at about 58 miles an hour. I was at about 1,028 RPMs.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's actually funny when I do my seminars, I don't mention the word spin once talking about backhands because the disc spins enough. Sidearm is, I say the word spin for
always
40 times.
Always trying to get that.
For that same reason, but that's interesting. So that is going to affect the disc at high speeds.
Mm-hmm.
What about slow speeds?
Let's talk about putting.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask. How come when you have a tailwind do putts drop? I always just assumed it was because they just did. When you explained it, I connected the dots immediately, and I went, oh, that's obvious why it's happening. But I never even put two and two together.
So discs, the reason our discs fly is because they're a wing. They're a wing. This is a cross section of a disc, and I mean, granted, our cross section narrows because it's also a circle. But air has to go over a disc, and the air that comes under a disc goes like this. So wherever you accelerate the air, pressure goes down. I think that's right. These people are going to really correct me. Pressure goes down, so that's what generates lift, all right? So that's why all these things are in play. Now, let's go like this. I've actually tested, Scott, that in my average putt from about 30 feet, I putt about 25 miles an hour. Now we're going to use the same rules. If I've got a 10 mile an hour headwind, we got this going. I'm going to use a different color. Let's go like this. This is going this way. 10 mile an hour this way. What is the apparent speed that my disc is going to be feeling? It's going to be feeling 35 miles an hour of airspeed. At 35 mile an hour of airspeed, my disc lifts.
That's because, if I'm not mistaken, wind does not travel at the same speed once it hits the edge of the disc. It accelerates faster over the top than the bottom.
Technically, yes. So the air going over the top, see, this air is running straight here, and this air has to travel more distance. In order for those two particles to come back together, this one's got to go faster. And so that creates highs and low pressures.
So the 35 mile an hour disc it's simply lifting more because it's a faster throw from the disc's perspective.
Correct. Another thing, I mean, this is going, that is technically the answer. Nose angle has a lot to do with compensating for that, right? We change our nose angles, and if you have a nose up a little just too much, it's going to completely change everything. If you have your nose up and you throw the disc, it's going to lift ridiculously. But let's go to the tailwind. I go 25 mile an hour, and I'm throwing this direction again, right? Let's do another paper. So for tailwind, I throw 25 miles an hour, and I'm throwing this direction. I've got a 10 mile an hour tailwind. Now, what we learned on our last page was that my disc doesn't feel the 25 miles an hour. It's going to feel the air it's flying in. And so if we subtract 25 minus 10, we end up with
15.
We end up with 15 mile an hour. Have you ever putted 15 miles an hour from 35 feet? Your disc doesn't want to get there. It doesn't have the air speed or the lift generated to actually get there.
So you need a 25 mile an hour putt from 35 feet to get to the chains. So if you chose to putt 15 miles an hour instead of 25 miles an hour, of course the disc doesn't have enough velocity to get there. For all intents and purposes, the same thing's happening.
Correct.
It is not. It's
less lift is being generated. It's not going to sustain flight.
And I think one of the interesting things, and we talked about this a lot, knowing this, some of these things is not even necessarily relevant to what you do. When you have a little bit of a tailwind, you need to putt a little higher. Knowing why that happens isn't necessary to knowing how high to putt, but the more information you have, the more you can start to evaluate situations that are less predictable.
Correct. So I want to throw something in on this, is that when you're putting, like I putt 25 miles an hour, and if I'm putting with no wind, my disc is going to slow down at a predictable speed. By the time it gets to the basket, it slows down. It has drag. There's other effects happening to it. And so if I miss, I know it has a predictable amount of speed when it lands, where how far it may roll, or if it lands flat, it's going to slide so far. When you're putting in a tailwind, most people don't intuitively think about it. But if you're putting into a tailwind and you accelerate your putt to try and beat the wind, then what you're doing is you're going beyond what you're used to throwing, your rhythm and your timing. But the disc is coming in hotter. Even if you throw your average putt of 25 mile an hour, the disc is coming in much hotter. It doesn't have any resistance, any drag to slow it down. So when it hits the ground, it often takes off and rolls much faster and acts more unpredictably than what you would have regularly figured it would have done, because it's just coming into the ground faster.
I love it. Now, what about disc angles? I always, and the way I teach it, again, I don't necessarily even care if I get the details right, as long as I'm teaching what to do to make the shot work. But I always teach the number one key to the win. Well, number one is to play conservative and lay up. But the number two technical way to play in the wind is try to throw flat. And I always just say it's because you're showing less of the surface of the disc to the wind. Is it as simple as just you're showing less surface area to hit, or is there something else going on when you throw at an angle?
Well, at an angle relative to the direction of the wind. So, actually grab one of those real quick. Okay? Just a piece of paper. Let's do a piece of paper.
Want some paper?
Yeah.
Well, I'm not grabbing that one.
So, if I've got the disc like this, and we've got a wind going straight at the camera, if I have the tail up, it's going to push. It's going to want to lift the back of the disc. If we have the air coming at me, a headwind, if I have the nose up, we have this much disc that the air is actually seeing. It's going to want to slow the disc down. You've got an enormous amount of drag having a wide angle to the disc. If we're going this direction and we have wind that's coming as a right to left, let's say, and we're traveling this way, we know that if you have the wing up, the disc is going to get grabbed by the wind and carried. We have to remember that when we're throwing into the wind or with the wind, whichever direction the wind is blowing, you have to think of that as like a river. You're in it. And so a disc flying with the wind, you can do angles to kind of compensate for dealing with the river. You've gone swimming before, and maybe not everybody's swimming a river, but when you have the stream going this way, if you try and swim straight across, where are you going to end up? You're going to end up finishing over here, because you're in a current, and that current's going to take you that way. If you want to end up straight there, you've got to swim what feels like you're going this way, and you're going to be fighting the current the whole way getting there. So the typical way the wind is going, think of it as a river. You got to be able to map in your head. Think of if I was underwater, which direction would the water be flowing around that tree? What would it be doing near where the basket is, down by that hill? Is the air going down the hill like this and flowing? Because it's all going to flow.
Yeah, and actually everyone who lives near the ocean knows this. If you're in California, the California current runs north to south. Of course, the Gulf Stream goes south to north on the East Coast. But if you're in California and you go out and swim in the ocean for 20 minutes and you come back in, your stuff's gone. You're sure it's been stolen. And then you remember that you're in California, which means it maybe actually was stolen. But you then walk up the beach north, and eventually you'll find your stuff.
Yeah.
But you don't feel it. So yeah, I totally get that. Now, what about rollers? Because you're showing potentially, well, depending on the direction of the wind, 100% of a disc surface to the wind. In fact, when players ask me, how do you roll in heavy winds? My answer is, you don't.
You don't.
And they say, no, but what if you have to throw a roller? My answer is, you throw flat into the fairway. But that's a very unsatisfying answer. But is it really just a matter of you're showing this much of the disc to wind? There's more surface area for it to hit. It just blows not unpredictably, but the variance is large.
The variance is huge because you have, let's put a boat here. A boat wants to sail, right? If you're going to sail a boat across the harbor, you've got wind blowing. They raise up a sail. They have a mast. They raise up a sail. They change that sail to the correct angle to get the most efficient push on the boat. And so when you take a disc and you're essentially raising a sail.
By the way, may I have permission to steal that?
Yeah.
Because I'm gonna that's gonna be my answer from now on. You can throw a wing, you can't throw a sail.
Yeah,
that's a little bit not more satisfying, but I think that words create visualizations, and visualizing because of those words is way better than saying just showing the surface of the disc to the wind. So I'm going to steal that.
Awesome. So I want to do something real quick and explain something too, because when we're just dealing with a straight headwind and a straight tailwind, we're dealing with just a plus and a minus, right? And so one of the things that's really interesting is that you can use the wind to accelerate a disc. You can use the speed differentials of the wind. That's why distance throwers, they like to, if I'm a right-hand backhand, I would like to have a left to right taily wind. I don't want a tailwind. I want a tailish wind, which means if I'm standing this way, I want it going like this. And I don't have massive hyzer flip for myself. I throw more of a anhyzer out of the box. But what that does is, if I've got, let's go like this. One more. This has to do with why the disc acts certain ways. Like I said, I throw about 60 miles an hour. And if I throw the disc at this angle, away from the wind, or into the wind. So what I'm doing is we're going to use this is we're going like this. We have a left to right wind for you. And if you just throw in a left to right wind, you're going to still be dealing with the subtraction problem, right? Like if I just throw with a left to right wind, I still have this air is the relative speed the disc is going to feel is slower. But you can turn the disc roller angle almost at an angle to the wind and throw it this direction. And so let's say that I'm going to go 20 because I like throwing in big wind.
Right.
If I go 20 mile an hour and I throw my disc this direction, I mean, it's going to end up over here because we're throwing at an anhyzer angle. I can use 60, and I'm going to actually, because the disc comes out of my hand like this. I don't know if it's the right angle to show the camera, but because the disc is coming out at an angle, I'm going to use the air blowing this way to push the disc. So as my disc is going 60, it's also getting pushed, it's getting accelerated. I think many of you have probably seen this when you throw a disc and all of a sudden, even if you just threw it with the hyzer and it's a right to left, all of a sudden the disc goes and accelerates because it's going to take on the inertia of the opposing wind. And so here we can use 60 plus 20 and I can get my disc potentially up to 80. Now if I can get to 80 miles an hour, I can get the disc to go technically 700 feet if I get it right.
Right.
Technically.
Yeah, for sure.
So understanding that you can use the wind to your advantage, you can put it in a sail, but what happens when you do that is you get unpredictability. Down the fairway, when I open the disc up to the wind, I'm not sure exactly where it's going to come. I can have my body and my angles and all my things correct, but I'm going for massive distance, I'm going to probably go be 800 feet down the fairway too.
Right. Now, what about the effect of the wind on the speed the disc is going? And because this is a great example, because distance is my forte, right?
Yeah.
Or it was before I aged. And this is exactly right. If you're a right-handed player and you were throwing that direction, you would throw the anhyzer into the wind. It was as predictable as the wind can get. It's the most predictable way to get distance. However, there's a trade-off, which is when the disc stalls out, on a perfect throw, it almost lands flat. Because the second the disc gets here, now it's dropping down. Okay, so that is the most consistent way to get maximum distance. However, some of the best, most impressive throws in history have not done that. And what I consider arguably the greatest distance throw ever, it's certainly one of the top three, was Sam Farron's world record. Okay. And Sam had the wind was blowing the wrong direction on a field that limited where he could be throwing a little bit. And so Sam threw the anhyzer with an overstable disc, the Phoenix, that pushed the disc down. And it was going to be a good throw. Sam always threw well. But the second that disc got flat, at the end of its flight as it was slowing down, it towered either 2 or 3 times. Everybody watched it, was like, that was good, that's great, that's a world record, holy crap. That was everyone's response.
Yeah.
But he broke the rules of throwing distance.
Correct.
Is the effect greater on the disc when it's going slower, or is it just more noticeable because it travels so much farther in a shorter period of time, you don't notice the same gains?
I think this is where we end up putting like the minds of people that throw really far. I'm not a major far thrower. I've gotten some good numbers, but you can outthrow me any given day, all day. I've been able to use the wind to my advantage to get numbers that most guys that throw 60 miles an hour can't get. And so dealing with like thermals, like we're talking, I did a short video on my channel having to do with, can I throw over 500 feet today? And I wasn't really feeling like I could, but there was wind, and it was the first day here in Phoenix where there had been wind, and it seemed like a year. And so I went out to the field and I began reading where the thermals were, understanding that I had a left to right wind. We had a left to right tailwind. We had a big parking lot that was really hot and it was kicking off thermals. And then I had a really good wind read with a red tail hawk came over and kind of started circling. And so I had this great idea where I knew where that thermal pocket was going to be. So let me get a red marker here
For the red-tailed hawk?
for the thermal.
Okay.
So there's a big parking lot and it was kicking off thermals. And so remember, we've got wind that's going this way, or this way, right? And so I was aligning myself with the throw to do what we're talking about. I'm using anhyzer first, and like you said, as the disc slows, it wants to fall. As it gets flat, then all of a sudden you lose the advantage at the end of the flight. But what I did is I did a test shot when the thermal was like right here. I had read it well enough. This hawk was over here circling, and this thermal was moving in a trajectory like this. And so I knew that once I threw right here on that angle, I was going to get a lot of lift. Like if we're going at a cross section, I threw my disc here, and this thermal mass was going here. So as it got into here, I got the acceleration of the tailwind, but I also got a big boost where the disc pushed up really high, really fast. Which is good because the higher it gets, the longer it has to glide. But what happened is my disc took off here, and as it got down the fairway, this is something we really haven't talked a lot about, is wherever you have a thermal, I'm gonna go into this just really quickly. We have warm air going up, right? This warm air is going up. Let's go arrows. As it's going up, it's displacing cold air from above. So everything outside of, is that blue marker? It's in this pocket. Everything outside of that thermal is pushing cold air down. Okay? So we're getting this warm air rising right here, lifting it, but once my disc got through that warm patch, which was probably, I'll bet you, is 150 feet wide. It was enough. Maybe as it grew, as it got down the fairway, maybe it got up to about 180 feet to 200 feet wide. It was a pretty big section that was going up. But once it got out of this, once the disc traveled to this point in time, the whole sky was pushing it down. So the disc, great flight, and then as it got out of there, right into this position, the nose went up, the tail dropped out, and it just fell to the ground.
But if it's up high enough, it would have fallen towards the ground, but it had time to hit the thermal.
It still had. So what I'm saying is,
back.
I threw this way into it, and as I got here, we got a lot of lift in here. So we got a lot of lift, and as it was coming back down here, once we cleared the thermal, the tail end of it out there is all cool air coming down.
So this is why the visual of a disc is that it can tower then drop, or then drop then tower.
Yes.
It does both, but they they often one after the other. Hey everyone, well if you got this far, you know this is chopped into smaller pieces to make it easier to download. You can click right here to watch part 3.